Hello, today we're going to be talking about exercise physiology. So we've been talking about all of the individual systems, and today this is really going to be sort of an example as we start to fit pieces together and understand how they work together to do the things that your body needs to do. We've been talking about that with blood pressure and with pH homeostasis and fluid homeostasis, and today we're going to put all of those pieces together to talk about how your body does stuff. We talked about muscles last semester, so we're going to need to touch on that a little bit. But this is really about putting together a bunch of the pieces, everything we've done so far this semester, to combine it and see how does your body work when you're exercising. We're using exercise because it puts a lot of strain on your body and it's something we can think about. It's something a lot of people care about. I know we have a bunch of student athletes in this class, but to some degree, it's really an example. I want you to be thinking about how does your body work all of the pieces together to do things? How does your body function with all of these systems together? And exercise is something that really draws on all these systems, and we can talk about how it comes together. So, what is exercise? Exercise is physical activity that goes beyond just the sort of normal little movements that you do. Pretty much anything that is enough movement to get your heart rate up a little bit, that's exercise. And that's what we're going to be talking about. When I say get your heart rate up, that's the sort of thing we're going to be thinking about. What is that? What's doing that? What happens in exercise? Now, the first thing about exercise that is going to be a major thing here is exercise uses energy. Anytime you're moving your muscles, they require energy. So when you move your muscles, you need to be able to produce energy for your muscles to use to do that movement. And the way that that energy works changes over time. And by over time, I mean really over the first 2 minutes. If you're sitting still and then you start sprinting and you sprint across the room at top speed, at first, you're using your phosphagen system. So phosphagen, creatine, to creatine phosphate, you've probably heard about creatine as the idea that taking an extra creatine might help people use that energy effectively. There's very limited evidence for that, but your body does use this creatinine phosphate or phosphagen system for that very first burst of energy. It doesn't need oxygen. It doesn't even break down glucose directly. It's a fast, immediate source of energy. You can just pop off phosphates, do this real fast, pop, pop, pop. But that only lasts a few seconds. Within the first 10 seconds, you're already on the down swoop of that. And that's when the glycolytic system really comes into play. Glycolytic, you're breaking down glucose, but you're not using oxygen yet. No mitochondria involved. It is low amount of energy that you're getting per glucose molecule, but it's really, really fast. So you can get fast, quick energy without needing extra oxygen from this phosphagen system and the glycolytic system. And that's going to give you this real hot, fast burst that allows you to do that rapid first sprint. Then, as that's starting to wind down, your oxidative system is going to kick in and turn over. And this is much more efficient. You get more energy per glucose molecule. And it goes all the way through and produces CO2. Your glycolytic system produces lactic acid that you're going to need to deal with later. So your oxidative system can just keep going. Your glycolytic system is short term. Your oxidative system can just keep going for a long period of time, producing this stable amount of energy. Now, it's not going to be as high as when you had this fast burst from the glycolytic and you were still able to use some oxidative, or when you had this real high burst from the phosphagen system. And this is this longer, more stable thing that you can maintain. So this is your first fast sprint. 60 seconds or less, that you're relying on those two. You're not breaking into this oxidative at all. But once you're going for a while, you're primarily relying on that oxidative, and it can go for a long time as long as you can keep it supplied with enough oxygen and glucose. And so the energy that we're seeing here comes from three different sources. It comes from glucose, comes from fatty acids, and it comes from amino acids. So our sort of base process works with glucose. And we start here with glucose, which is broken down into pyruvic acid. And this gives us a little bit of ATP here, this breakdown. And that pyruvic acid can either continue here where we need oxygen, or it can be shunted off as lactic acid, and we just keep making more, holding on to it as lactic acid, and we'll come back to it later. That's that glycolytic, so that glycolysis system here. So here's our glycolysis system, but then if we keep going, we can break down that pyruvic acid into acetyl-CoA, send that through the citric acid cycle to the electron transport chain, where we use oxygen, produce carbon dioxide, and produce a lot of ATP. Protein, a lot of it's going to go into tissue protein, into building your own proteins in these amino acids, but some of it is going to be broken down for energy. And this goes through the urea cycle. It produces urea as a waste product, but it can then feed into the citric acid cycle as well. So a lot of the urea that comes out in the urine, we're seeing from here, but then we can go into the citric acid cycle, same system. Fats can be broken down in the fatty acid spiral into acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA then feeds into this same system. So we can use all of these for energy, but what you really notice here is this rapid spiraling glycolysis where you get this fast energy. We really need glucose to do that. So here it all is broken down a little more. I'm not going to go over the biochemistry of this in any detail. We've got lots of other classes, but that key thing is we can do this one of two ways. We can either send it into this electron transport chain needing oxygen, or hang out with this lactic acid. But lactic acid, if we build up lactic acid, it's going to need to be converted back later. So we can build up lactic acid, but in the end, after we're done with exercise, it's going to get taken back, turned back into pyruvate, and sent into the electron transport chain to produce more oxygen and clear out the lactic acid, because lactic acid is acidic, right? It's an acid. And that building up in the muscles is actually going to be really important for a number of reasons. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but remember what we've talked about with pH before. Think for a sec. What does making the system more acidic do in terms of respiration? All right, so that's our sort of basic metabolism system. Now I want to talk about the control systems that are happening here. So when you're exercising, even if you're not stressed, it's going to activate your sympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system here is going to play in, and it's going to activate all those fight or flight things that are also really important for exercise. These are closely tied. So some of these are a little less important if it's not a stressful situation, like dilating the pupils, but it's going to relax your bronchi and speed up your breathing, increase your respiration. It's going to accelerate your heartbeat. It's going to inhibit your digestive system, right? You don't need to focus on that right now. It's going to cause sweating. It's going to stimulate your liver to produce glucose. So there's more of that glucose for that fast energy in your system. It's going to stimulate your renal glands to produce adrenaline and noradrenaline. It's going to inhibit bladder contraction. It's also important for stimulating orgasm, but we're going to talk about that later on when we get to the reproductive system. So all of this sort of plays in to that exercise physiology, keying you up for exercise. So we talked about this enhancing respiration, and that comes from the sympathetic nervous system. It comes from low tissue oxygenation because your tissues are using that oxygen. And it also comes from your blood becoming more acidic. Now, why is your blood becoming more acidic? Some of it is because CO2 is building up in your system, and that's going to decrease the pH. Some of it is because of that lactic acid that we talked about, right? And that lactic acid is going to increase the acidity, decrease the pH, cause your respiratory system to respond to that by increasing your respiratory rate. And so that causes this ventilatory response. When you start, so before you actually start exercising, when you know you're heading into it and you're thinking about it, that's going to key up your sympathetic nervous system, which is going to start keying up your ventilation before you even start exercising. So here we have the start of exercise, and you can see that you've already keyed up a little bit with the sympathetic nervous system. And depending on the level of exercise, the ventilation will rise to different levels. Then when you stop exercising, you're going to notice this slow decline where there will continue to be increased breathing rates after exercise. So I'm not going to answer this question now. I'm not going to talk about why, because this is actually a thing we're going to talk about on the case study. But I want you to start thinking about why would we have these elevated breathing rates after you're done exercising? Keep that in mind. With heart rate, we'll see this increased heart rate with exercise. Again, some of that's the sympathetic nervous system. Some of that is what we've talked about before, which is increased venous return. So the movement of your muscles is going to increase the return of blood to your heart, which will increase the beating of your heart. We also see a fairly complicated endocrine response. There's a lot going on hormonally. We'll see some things elevate immediately. So this is the amount of time that you spend exercising. This is the hormone concentration. So what you'll notice, so different things are going to have different effects. Insulin is actually generally going to drop with exercise, especially with extended exercise, because you're going to be using up that glucose. So glucagon, we'll see it being relatively stable until you've started to use up a lot of that glucose, in which case it'll kick up. With cortisol, again, we see fairly stable until basically you start stressing out the body with extended exercise, at which point we start to see the cortisol kick up. Epinephrine, we see a kick up immediately, and then an even higher kick up at the end when the body starts getting stressed out with this. And growth hormone, interestingly, also see a kick up, and this is for recovery, for sending your body into recovery as those muscles need to be rebuilt because of the micro tears that are going to happen in exercise. And as hopefully you remember from when we studied muscles before, those micro tears that happen during exercise are what causes muscle to build. And we especially see that in resistance exercise. So when you're lifting weights, you'll see that those micro tears causing the muscles to build. So in addition to all of that, where we've really been talking about sort of metabolism and muscle, we also have to think about thermoregulation. So when you are exercising, your muscles are working, they're undergoing metabolism, and that is causing heat production. So that heat production then produces extra heat that your body needs to get rid of to be able to maintain a stable temperature. So to do this, then your body starts sending blood out to the skin, where it can come into contact, come very close to the skin and lose heat just through air contact at the skin. And in addition, there will be sweat coming out, which is going to cause evaporative heat loss, further cooling the skin and therefore cooling the blood that comes up. This is where you'll see the flushing response, where you see redness in the skin. That's because of that blood coming up to the surface. So when you're exercising, your blood flow changes a lot. So in general, your blood flow to your muscles is going to go up a lot. And that's for obvious reasons. Your blood flow to your skin is going to go up a variable amount depending on your thermoregulatory needs. So that's going to be important for sweat and also for that direct cooling. The amount of blood that's going to your brain is actually going to be pretty similar, which means it'll be a lower percentage because there's more blood flow per minute. So less blood flow, lower percentage of blood flow going to your brain, even though the amount is still pretty similar. It's pretty similar with bones and kidneys. You're actually going to see a down regulation. Less blood flow is going to go to the kidneys because we don't want it filtering out right now. We need that blood pressure. So we're telling the kidneys, don't worry about this. We don't want to deal with this right now. Deal with it later. The heart, we maintain about the same percentage, which means it's drastically increased volume. And the gut decreases pretty drastically because we basically turn off digestion during exercise. We say, nope, not doing that right now. Sympathetic nervous system cuts it off. We don't need to worry about that. We'll worry about that later. Right now, we're running from a bear. Because your body basically parses all exercise as that sort of urgency. That's how the sympathetic nervous system responds. In addition to that, so that's our blood. There's one other really important concept we need to talk about, which we talked about respiration, and we've talked about perfusion, that blood flow. Now we need to talk about oxygen consumption. So oxygen consumption relates to the activity of your muscles, the ventilation happening with your respiratory system, and the circulation happening with your blood flow. So the more you exercise, the more oxygen you are going to consume up to a certain max. Everyone has a different VO2 max. And the more athletic you are, you can increase the VO2 max, but there also are certain limits. And those limits vary based on a lot of things, person to person. And so there is a sort of a theoretical max limit. There's an individual max limit, what you can do right now. And then there's a theoretical max limit. If you were in perfect condition, the best you could possibly be in, what could you reach? And that's going to vary a lot person to person. And that can actually determine how fast and hard you can go in endurance exercise. Exceptional endurance athletes have a very high VO2 max. So when I teach this section, I always get questions from people about what sorts of exercise are the best. And that really depends a lot on your goals. But because that depends so much on your goals, I want to talk more some very general stuff and some health focused stuff. So some of this there's lots of research going on this and the guidance changes. What I can tell you is, first of all, high intensity exercise is important. Getting some high intensity exercise is really important for your heart. And so even very small amounts, like 5 minutes a day of high intensity exercise, make a huge difference. Another one is give your muscles time to heal. One of the common mistakes that young athletes especially make is not taking their rest days. Especially if you're doing resistance exercise, it's really important. If you do a good, solid, hard resistance weightlifting workout, your muscles are going to need 48 to 72 hours to repair those micro tears to be able to successfully work out and go through this process again and have it benefit rather than potentially harm. So you really don't want to work the same muscles at all, less than 48 hours apart. Like don't even do related muscles, and then you don't want to do the exact same workout less than 72 hours apart, hitting the exact same targets. So, if you are doing curls one day and then 2 days later doing push-ups, you're okay. That's 48 hours. You're still hitting those same muscles, but you're not hitting them in the same way and in the same precision. But you shouldn't be doing anything related within 48 hours. Another one is about pain. So some amount of DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, is a completely normal part of resistance exercise. That the next day having some soreness, that's about those muscle tears, that's fine, that's normal. If you feel pain during your workout, that is a bad sign and you should stop. And the other thing is for health, you want a mix of aerobic and anaerobic. So stuff that's really working hard for very short periods of time, sprinting, resistance exercise, things like that. And stuff that's working your lungs and your heart, giving you that aerobic where you're keeping that exercise going for a while is also important. So you're going to see a mix of both of those is really what's the best for your health. I'm happy to take more questions about this in class or on the discussion board. If you haven't figured it out, I'm a gym rat. I'm super happy to talk about this, but this is my general summary. All right, sorry, and that's not part of this. And that's the end of today's lecture. Thank you very much.